Okay, according to the world's most unreliable source, the internet, social media, the FBI has announced that the search for Frank Matthews, who's been wanted for 50 years, is over. Now, I couldn't find a federal press release saying that. I don't know where this came from. Everyone just reposts each other's stuff. Anybody can find a federal press release saying that happened. I will Zelle you or PayPal you $50. Don't make a fake one. I want to see the website. But anyway, so of course, a lot of you, my subscribers, are familiar with the Frank Matthews story. And I keep having this new chapter I want to do because I was finally able to get a hold and have transcribed this rare book, Easy Money, that was written in the late 70s. That wasn't really about Matthews. It was about Matthews, but it was the writer, Donald Goddard, worked with this young Cuban guy, George Ramos, who went into witness protection. He disappeared into witness protection, and he really was the main, well, he was one of a couple main witnesses against Frank Matthews in the big Venezuela, Corsica to Venezuela to Haiti deal that, of course, opens that, or that's talked about in my Frank Matthews story, and that opens White Powder, Black Power, where the Corsican courier, Jules Serini, is caught bringing in like 20 pounds of pure heroin, but that was just an initial run, and Matthews had made a Corsican connection, and they were going to start flooding. And what was really interesting, we need to make a movie series out of this. I mean, a TV series. The Black Boardwalk Empire. So what was going on in 71, 72, a drought had kicked in. Stuff was hard to get. If Matthews had got this new, because the French connection had kind of been broken, but this new way of bringing it into Venezuela and then over to Haiti and then into the U.S., there was going to be a new route. Because the problem was the feds had gotten onto all the routes from Europe. South America route into Miami had gotten hot, because that had been the route that replaced the route coming out of France. And in reading this book, I also learned a lot of interesting things that were going on that may be of interest of you concerning Frank Matthews. For example, him and his right-hand man, Mickey Beckwith, were kind of going their separate ways. Beckwith was setting up in Los Angeles to start dealing with Mexican Brown H, which kind of took over the game going into the mid-70s. But the most fascinating stuff is about Frank Matthews, Mr. Mysterious, and his personality himself, because this Ramos, who again became a federal informant and went into witness protection, worked with the author and was relaying all these experiences he had of being with Frank Matthews. And Matthews sold dope different than everybody else. And it was kind of weird for a drug dealer, but it actually was brilliant because it was like what a real business person would do. Matthews would just buy everything. You were somebody with a half brick somewhere, he'd buy it. You had 100,000 in nickel bags bundled up, he'd buy it. He wanted it all so that he could be the one who everyone had to then buy from. So he would just buy everything up. He was everywhere. He was making small deals. He was making big deals. He was buying whatever. But he came up in the late 60s off of Yayo. There was a tremendous amount of money in COKE even by the mid to late 60s because it was being sold for $100 a gram back then. And the Cubans, who had the lock on things, wouldn't let the price go down. And $100 back in 72 is like $600 now. Imagine you could get $1,500, $1,800 for an 8 Bazal today. It was truly the rich person's drug. Frank made, but it was in New York, at least you could buy it on the street in dimes. That was probably the only place in the country you could, or in 25 packs. So the movie Superfly, and Frank Matthews dated So, in Superfly, he had those two women, the white woman and the light-skinned black woman. Frank and Fraser, something Fraser was her name. Frank was dating her in real life. And people on the street at the time thought that movie was more so based about Frank Matthews, actually, than anybody. And if you kind of look at the One Last Big Deal, and, he had an army of people on the street pushing C. That Matthews had a lot of that going on too. But Matthews' organization was so big, there's a park, for those of you from Brooklyn, Brower Park in Bed-Stuy. So much activity around there by the Dutch Schultz gang. They were selling $17,003 packets a day. $45,003 each. This is $45,000 a hard way for real. But around this time, 71, 72, there was push from, there was 10 pushers killed in the Brower Park area by Rastafarians, Sunni Muslims, black community activists, Black Panthers, Black Liberation Army. There was a lot of pushback in New York, especially, I think a little bit in Detroit, of just activists killing drug dealers. In Philly, they were extorting them, which is different. They were actually killing them and wanting them out of the community in New York. So Frank had a lot of different problems going on. There is a whole big mafia. I have multiple Frank Matthews stories I just never get to. There is some new information with the mafia, but I don't think. So going back to, did the case get closed against Frank Matthews? Why would the feds announce a case was closed? And anyways, the press release says the FBI wasn't handling his case. Once you're a fugitive, it's the U.S. Marshals, and it's the DEA who indicted him. So I don't know, that might be fake news. When Shorty Buse, one of the people we interviewed in the Frank Matthews doc back in 2012, died about 6 years ago, the feds lined the highway in Baltimore to the cemetery with Frank Matthews wanted posters. So they thought there was a good chance he was alive as of recently. But I did have a new thought that dawned on me. George Ramos, Cuban. So we've been fed so much about Colombians in the 80s and all that, but the real interesting stuff is that bridge from 1960. So if you remember in The Godfather, the rebels push Batista out and the mob has to leave Cuba. Well, all those wealthy Cubans that left, they wanted Cuba back. America didn't want a communist country on their back door, 90 miles from Key West. And, this is a whole big, long sub-thing with the Cubans I won't go into, but Cubans were trained to invade Cuba and take it back. It failed at the Bay of Pigs. You had all these embittered, many died, were imprisoned in Castro's prison for trying to conquer the country or retake it back. There was a lot of embittered, highly trained Cubans floating around Miami who, like the Contras later in the 80s, once again fighting communism in El Salvador, were kind of allowed to commit crimes, and they were controlling the yayo business. And Frank had a connection to one of them, and he reached out to the Corsicans, and they were going to do the Venezuela to Haiti pipeline. But by this time, there was Rosenbaum, who was a supplier of cutting agents, had contacted the feds and said he wanted to be a witness as long as he was allowed to keep the profit from the illegal deals he did. Babe Cameron, who was someone from Durham, North Carolina, who had been charged with some crimes. He was selling D for Frank in Durham. He got charged with some crimes. He turned state's evidence. And a guy from the Dutch Schultz gang, that was his nickname, but there was two black guys, was gonna testify against Frank. So that's how they had the wiretaps up, and they were listening in on Frank as he was talking to the Cubans to set up these deals coming out of Corsica into Venezuela, then bounce them into Haiti and bounce them into the U.S. That was going to be the new pipeline. So I don't think there was an announcement that they stopped looking for Frank Matthews. I don't know why they would announce they're not looking for somebody. Unless, Frank could have went to Cuba. It all makes sense. Did Frank Matthews just go and stay in Cuba? Another infamous criminal, Robert Vesco, one of the first people to embezzle a huge amounts of money and disappear, who was financing drug deals, who had Costa Rica change their whole constitution in the 70s so he wouldn't be extradited, lived out in an ocean vessel like a James Bond villain so he couldn't be arrested. He eventually went sideways in Cuba, and they kept him in a Cuban prison for a long time, and they claim he died in Cuban prison a few years ago. Matthews could have blended in Cuba, given them some money. That kind of makes sense. But if anyone can find, I got $50 Zelle for you if you find me a federal website that says they dropped the charges on Frank Matthews. But more Frank Matthews coming.